Interactional competence in a second language, longitudinal studies and their implications. We're trying to get a grasp on what is interactional competence, how can it be defined, and how does it develop. Our prima facie questions are not how can we teach interactional competence, are not how can we test interactional competence, or how can we develop curricula in that regard. So for me, this presentation is kind of an opening of a dialogue. So let me start with a prelude. From communicative to interactional competence. We all know that, but it's always good to remember. Throughout the past decade, the notion of interactional competence has gained unprecedented attention in both research on second language acquisition, research on second language use also, but also in terms of practical and more applied issues like the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, which I understood has become a reference framework for the United States also. So the history of this in 30 seconds is 1972, right? Hymes forges the concept of communicative competence. It was a sea change in our thinking about language. It was a sea change in our thinking about learning. And it had a lot of empirical and practical impact on teaching. Most of the research enjoying this notion of communicative competence has been interested in pragmatic competence and has been looking essentially at, I'm simplifying a bit, speech acts, right? So that's very interesting research. However, in 1986, Claire Cramsch calls in a renowned statement for research that goes beyond, I'm quoting, oversimplified view of human interaction. So essentially her point was that with the notion of communicative competence, we start to see language as embedded in contexts and in social and pragmatic environments, but we don't get a grasp yet at the fine mechanism of coordination of social interaction when people talk to each other in real time. Then in the 90s, we saw essentially a move towards conceptualization of interactional competence. John Kelly Hall was a pioneer, Richard Young was a pioneer. These are not so much systematic empirical studies. They are more models of what the different aspects are that we need to consider when we start thinking about interactional competence. And then we had to actually wait till the mid or almost the second part of the 2000 and the start of 2000 to 2010 until we had systematic longitudinal studies on the development of second language interactional competence. And the pioneering work is certainly Hellerman 2008. I don't know whether you're familiar with him. And then Hall, Hellerman, and myself edited the volume in 2011 that brought together a couple of people looking amongst other longitudinal. So this is in a snapshot how things develop. When we look at interactional competence, we want to get at the fine knitted details of the mechanics of social coordination, essentially, right? Turn taking and things like that. Now, my second part of the prelude is this. Why study interactional competence? Given the history of second language acquisition research, and I would even say given the history of Western linguistics, it is not a banal question. Our thinking about language and our thinking about social, about acquisition is massively impregnated by formalist thinking of language and cognitivist thinking of how people learn, right? So why study interactional competence? First, the human interaction engine. Stephen Levinson is one of the famous people alerting us to the fact that humans have a specific ability for social interaction, and he argues that this ability is not comparable. It's unmatched anywhere in animal world. Think of turn taking, minimization of gap and overlap, microseconds usually. Research has shown that the average in turn taking in English, British and American English and so on, is around 0.3, 0.4 milliseconds, the average gap between turns. That's highly coordinated social action. Think of repairing. So humans have apparently this unique ability to interrupt conversation and request clarification. And sometimes it's done in ways that don't really interrupt, right? More smoothly. Think of organization of actions sequentially. We enter a restaurant and we know exactly, tack, 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 one turn triggers the other turn and so on. So there is something unique about the human ability for social interaction. Second part of this issue is that it has been argued that language evolves out of social interaction, and more precisely out of the uniquely human modes of social interaction. So many different streams of thinking come to this persuasion that social interaction is the root of language. And for us here it's important because it also means that social interaction is not only an object of learning. We have seen this morning that social interaction is also a site of learning, right? It all boils down to the fact that we need to understand social interaction in order to understand language and also language learning. So the key question here after this was just, what happens when we move into a second language? This question can be split up in three sub-questions. What does the development of interactional competence in a second language consists of? Can we see some features? Can we see some tendencies? Second, is interactional competence simply transferred, this was mentioned this morning, from the L1, or is it somehow re-elaborated, recalibrated? I like the notion of recalibrated in the second language, right? Is it re-adapted? And this will be the last part of my paper, what implications ensue for second language education. The argument is based on I'd say, operational notion of interactional competence. I'm a conversation analyst, so I'm indebted to ethnomethodology. And in that sense, I work with the definition of interactional competence as based on the developments of methods, systematic procedures we as members use for practical actions. That is, ways of opening a conversation, procedures for closing down a conversation, procedures for taking a turn, procedures for foreshadowing a next action, and so on and so on. Agreeing, disagreeing, opening storytellings, systematic procedures. We will see in this paper that these systematic procedures change over time in terms of a diversification. We will look, for instance, at repair, we will look at turn taking, we will look at story openings, and in all these contexts we will see essentially that people move from a monolithic way of doing things to a diversified ways of doing things. We will see that they develop more and more ability to adapt to others, which we call recipient design in conversation analysis. And we will also see that because there is this diversification of resources, people become more and more able to adapt to the specific others that are co-present and to the local circumstantial details of their interaction. Prerequisites. I think as a researcher, it's extremely important that I delimit what I can show and what I can't show. I'm going to say something about interaction as a site of learning, right? We learn through social interaction. I can say something about interaction as an object of learning. Still, we know that learning is occasioned by many other things. Grammar exercises, writing, vocabulary tables, memorizing. And it's important when we as researchers go to the practitioners that we clearly delimit what the range of our expertise is. A second part of prerequisite is maybe think about what can we reasonably teach and what not. can we teach turn taking? I'm not sure about that. Maybe yes. Can we teach disagreement? Maybe. Maybe that would be, just as we teach, request formats. Maybe we could teach disagreement formats. Who knows? Storytelling? Maybe. Maybe these are not relevant objects, but it's just examples for, we can make a list of 30 maybe here. It's just examples of things. And I think that's important also. First of all, as a researcher, I need to tease apart what can I talk about, what can't I not reasonably talk about. But then when we talk between us, we also need to tease apart what is realistic to be taught and what is not realistic to be taught. So those are the prerequisites. Then maybe applicability of CA research, applicability of conversation analytic research. For me, one of the major issues is validity. What is valid as a scientific observation might not necessarily, is not ipso facto, automatically valid for practitioners, or even for teacher trainers, or for didacticians, researchers in didactics or pedagogy. I feel that maybe some things need to be boiled down, some complexities need to be reduced on the side of research, so that then the complexities can be added on the side of application. I'm not trying we need to simplify the world. What I'm trying is maybe as researchers we need to go down, make things a bit clear, come out with something that's simplified with regard to the empirical realities that we have been observing, but that's operational so that it can then become complexified again for application. And one way of simplifying things without losing too much of the subtle details might be just to think sometimes in terms of very isolated features, like we've been doing this morning. We've looked at data across several months of the same student, right? And we started an observation. The first observation was, wow, the student becomes much more fluent. Great, but how can we pin that down? And then what we started to do is look at, turn taking. Just an example. Oh, you can look at one little thing and you see that the person, how he starts the turns, that has changed. Or you could look at disagreements. Look just at disagreements. Or look at question formats. When you want to look more at the teaching or the tutoring side, just look at question formats. Sometimes maybe we can just look at one action that is very frequent, very recurrent, and get a grasp through that. It's like through a looking glass, right? Then I think it's important to when we do these things, think about these things. Teaching, testing, curriculum design, teaching material. Some observations from research might be particularly relevant for teaching. Others might not be applicable in teaching, but maybe in testing. And others yet might feed into material design. So again, I think there is some need for teasing apart things. My second but last point, chain of experts. We need a chain of experts. Think about testing, for instance. You're testing, right? I'm doing applied linguistics. But between me and you, maybe we would need, these researchers in testing. I could go to them and say, this is what we know about interactional competence. They can talk to me and say, this is what we know about what's testable, what's not testable, what's the mechanism, what's the flaws. And then together we can go to you, and you would need to tell us, these are the problems of concrete applicability. So I think that it's, for certain things, we need a chain of experts. The question, what can reasonably be practiced inside the classroom? And what needs to be carried out outside of the classroom? It's clear, the classroom time is extremely limited, and that's a massive problem. And I'm persuaded that across the world, we need much more to think about ways to carry language learning situations, language learning infrastructure outside of the classroom.